Love and Dragon Radio. I'm your host, M.L.Ruscsak. I'm here with my special guest today, John DeSimone. Did I say that right?
Excellent.
Awesome.
Thank you, yes.
So you're an author, which is cool because that's what I set the show up for originally. And you have the Rare Bird books out right now.
Mm-hmm.
What is that about?
Well, Rare Bird is the publisher, and they're here in Los Angeles, where I'm at. They're a really good, solid regional publisher.
Awesome.
And my book is called The Road to Delano, which is also a California story, and it centers around the epic grape strike that took place in Delano in 1968. Actually, from 65 to 70, but in 68 is when my book takes place, and it's centered around Cesar Chavez's fast for nonviolence. So he's not an actual main character in the book; he's in the background.
Okay.
But the main characters are two high school students who are faced with one's the son of a grower, and one is the son of a farm worker. So you have the two sides of the story. And they're best friends because they're on the baseball team, but they come from different worlds. And they're both faced with a series of moral choices as the book progresses that challenges as young men, as men growing up in the world and taking their place. So it's kind of a coming of age story for Jack. It's a moral tale from Aiden's point of view, and it's a historical novel in that the history is correct. So I have them. So that's kind of the gist of it.
Okay, so why did you choose historical fiction or a historical type novel?
Yeah. So this is my second one I've had published. I've written 2 or 3 others that never were published, and so I was teaching freshman writing, and I came across a book of essays that I had the students respond to on the history of civil disobedience, starting from Socrates and going down to Martin Luther King, and that's one of the series of essays was on.
Are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
You cut out there for a second.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
And I knew that Cesar Chavez was involved in the grape strike, but I didn't know to what extent he had dedicated his life to helping these poor people, because they really were poor at the time and are still at the lower end of the economic scale. So I began reading about him, and I understood that he used nonviolence for the very first time in history as a form of labor action. And I thought, wow, this is really a great subject for a book. And I looked around, and no one had actually written anything about it. There's plenty of books by those who have immigrated and worked in the fields, but none about why and what Cesar Chavez actually accomplished. So I thought, well, I want to write a novel about that. I didn't think it would be a historical novel, but as you get into it, if it's not accurate in the history, then the credibility of the story is lessened. And so I really made sure it was accurate, and then it just fell into the genre of historical. And that's what I enjoy writing.
Well, there we go. I have a couple historical authors within my publishing house. Now, I know the tedious research they do, and I love authors for this because we will research everything from the color of a grape to how long it takes to grow, just to make the story accurate.
Yes, and because there will always be someone who knows what you're talking about. The majority of the readers don't have any idea what grapes or how they grow or where they grow even, and who picks them, and what they do in the months when they're not picking. And so I live about 4 hours from Bakersfield, Delano area, and I made a lot of trips up there and researched in the library, was able to interview people. And that was about a two-year journey to figure this all out. A lot of trips to used bookstores. And so, yes, you're like a detective because many of the experiences of, I would say, the most disenfranchised are not recorded. You know, the experiences of the wealthy are easy. They can write a book or have someone write it about them.
Right.
So, it was challenging from that point of view. But I found my greatest resources in speaking to people that were there during that time and in used bookstores. There
we go. Because with writing historical fiction, it's always important to find people that survive that genre, that area. That
if you can, yes, absolutely.
Yes. I mean, you're not going to find someone that was in the Civil War, obviously.
There you go, right.
But if it's closer to modern time, and this was
1960, so yes, you would think.
Yeah, so it's still modern time. There should be enough people that are alive that remember the time.
Well, yes, and the people were high school students at that time, are now, the baby boomers, and I was able to meet several of those and talk with them, and you get the feel for the times, what it was like going to school during this. It was a very partisan, if you can imagine. The growers and were adamant they were not going to negotiate with Mexican Americans. They saw them, or the Filipinos, or any ethnic group, they saw them as beneath themselves. It was, and so they didn't see them as able to arrange their own affairs. They were very paternalistic toward them. So as long as they felt that the living conditions were one notch above the countries they came from, being Mexico and the Philippines, their conscience was assuaged. But the living conditions of most of them were primitive. So that was what Cesar Chavez reacted to. He just wanted a fair shake for the workers. He wasn't asking for anything for free.
Right. We go from people working to the greater good to their own version of the greater good, but we won't get into that because I don't know the whole history behind it.
You mean the history behind agriculture?
Yeah, because I'm not up to speed on the whole Mexican.
Sure.
I don't know.
Well, if in just 1 minute, so agriculture in the Central Valley, as soon as the railroads in the 1870s, 1860s opened up Central California, we had the gold rush in 1850, but that petered out after about a decade.
Right.
So once the railroad came in the 1860s, early 1870s, they started laying track down the Central Valley and bringing people in, and farmers from the east found that the Central Valley soil was the most fertile soil anywhere in the world. It's the deepest topsoil of any section of land in the world. So it was very fertile. It could grow anything if it had water, and it was basically free land. So the Central Valley became an agricultural hub from the very beginning. And unlike in the Midwest, where you're growing very large crops, potatoes and wheat, and you have a static population that can come in during the harvest season and help harvest. There wasn't that in California, so they always had to import labor. There's always, so first it was the Chinese, then it was the Okies during the Depression, and you read about that in Grapes of Wrath. Indigenous who came from the South, who lost their farms, and Okies and Midwesterners. And farming was always a profit, farmers worked on very thin profit margins.
Right.
So labor was the only thing they could control. And so they had to keep their costs down. I'm giving you their point of view.
Right.
And so from their point of view, if they had to pay union wages and all of these other benefits that come with normal workplace rules, they didn't feel they could make a profit. So, and farming from the time of, with refrigeration and shipping, you're competing always on a global scale, even back in the early 1900s. So there was always unrest in the Central Valley from the very beginning. And the farmers wouldn't allow the Chinese to settle. They wouldn't allow the Filipinos. They brought Filipinos over here, but they didn't allow them to bring their wives. Think about that, because they didn't want them to become part of the community. They just were there for their labor. That's it. And when they got old, they had to go home. So it was it didn't maybe start out to be abusive, but it became a very abusive situation. And you had all these migrants who would come through. There wasn't enough places for them to sleep. They'd sleep out in the open fields. They'd sleep in their cars. There's no toilet facilities. I mean, that just wasn't something farmers provided, and so communists came in, make a long story short, and tried to organize in the 30s, 40s. That's what Steinbeck was writing about. And so the farmers were deadly afraid of communists. And they broke up the unions because they were communist inspired. Who would want a communist run union on their farm?
Right.
So there's just a deep animosity here that stretched back decades. And by the time Cesar Chavez came on the scene in the 50s, the abuses were pretty settled in and pretty accepted by the community. If you want to work here, but they could make just enough wage that was more than what they ever could make in Mexico.
Right.
So people would come every season, and it was just such poverty in the Central Valley that Cesar Chavez, who had become an organizer for another organization, spent his early life, picking crops with his parents, said, I'm going to do something about this. And he was not a communist. He was a Catholic, and he was motivated by his Catholic faith. And that's where the nonviolence came in, and that's what made him a different individual. And he was a true leader of the people, and he advocated nonviolence. So the growers, every time there was unrest, new rumors of strikes, they would bring in their heavies who would break it up. They didn't care how they broke it up. They would use clubs. They would use scare people on the roads, run trucks close to the picketers, do whatever they had to do just to demoralize them. And then strikers, being just human beings, thought, well, we'll take revenge. And as soon as the violence started, the growers would call in, the sheriff would call in the National Guard. They're all arrested, and then the cycle would just start all over again. And
civil unrest at its best.
Exactly. It was just a continuous cycle that had been going on for decades.
And then we can actually relate some of this that's going on today. We still have the migrant workers in the valley. I mean, they're there. You can't say they're not.
They're there, absolutely. And with the success of the union, the UFW, and here's the odd thing about it, the historical element, I had no idea. It goes back to FDR, and this was, to me, fascinating, discovering this. So strikes were always very, very violent. Labor actions in our country has a history of violence. The steel strikes in the 1880s. It was not uncommon for strikers to shoot at owners and owners to strike back, and they just used violence. That was the only method they could use, once anger got to a certain point. So FDR said, we're going to put a stop to this. And he got through the legislation called the National Labor Relations Act, 1933, granting workers in every classification in the country the right to collective bargaining. They didn't need, so the communists now were out. The heavy labor leaders with their violent tactics were out. Individuals in a job, if they wanted to collectivize, they got together, they took a vote, and they invited a union to come in and represent them. And that's what put the end to major labor unrest across our country.
I did not know that.
Yes, that law covered every category of worker except for two. And it was the Southern Democrats who Jim Crow was still in effect, and black workers were sharecroppers on their lands, and black workers were housekeepers in their houses. And they said those two categories can never have collective bargaining. They told FDR, we'll sign this, we'll back you, we'll sign the law if you exclude farm workers and domestic workers. And that's the beginning of the unrest from 1933 till 1978, when Governor Brown changed it here in California. Farm workers could not organize. The growers had a right to break up these strikes, legal right. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yep.
So Cesar Chavez was starting in a hole before he even began.
Right, because the federal government had already put a lid on it years before.
Right, and so we don't recognize you. So he was not just striking for better wages, he was striking for a fairer system. Now think about it. Would you go to if you were an employee, and you've been an employee sometime in your life, and it's only fair that you get a bathroom break.
Right.
It's only fair that you have a right to bring water, or the employer would provide a drinking fountain in your place of work.
Yeah.
And he wouldn't dock you pay when you have to leave your desk or leave your machine to go to the bathroom and come back. Now think of a farm worker. They're way out in these fields. They might be a mile or 2 miles from a bathroom. And since they're doing piecework, it's all on them. If they want to walk to the bathroom, it's their time. If they want water, they have to bring it. And if they want bathrooms, if they want a break because of the heat, everything is on them. So there was a basic unfairness, because Cesar Chavez was not a stupid man. He only had an 8th grade education, but he knew how things worked. And to make a clear point, he is an American-born person. He was born in Arizona. So this was not about illegal immigration or illegal immigrants. This was truly about the rights of American workers. So his leadership, he led by example. So when he decided to organize a union,
Mhm.
he quit his job that gave him a middle class income, and he became one of them. He identified with them, and he led by example. So he ate the same things they ate. He was among them, and that's why he was so revered and respected. And he asked them to sacrifice to create a union, and he sacrificed for himself. So it was a true movement as well as a labor uprising. And when in 1970, when the first strike was over, and he signed labor contracts with almost every major grower in the valley, grape grower, excuse me.
Yes, grape grower.
Grape grower, because then lettuce came next. It was a monumental achievement. It had never been done, and there was peace. Workers knew the rules. Growers had to provide, potties, water, breaks, other safety requirements, and they had to pay a fair wage. And a fair wage was maybe only a quarter more an hour. I mean, it wasn't huge. So it was a true undertaking and a breathtaking undertaking.
Right.
So that's why I thought
yeah,
this is a book to write about. This is a guy to write about.
There's so many historical figures that start out disadvantaged and rise up through it. But
yes.
We still see this today, unfortunately. I mean, we still have the migrant workers that no one wants in society. This isn't about immigration. This is about the workers that are already here.
That's it, yes.
Then we still have the civil disobedience with the protests that we see across the country right now on different matters, not just civil rights. Well, it is civil rights because they're protesting being kept at home and away from jobs. But
yes, that's a little different, but civil disobedience is in the DNA of Americans.
Yes.
So
it's
in our DNA to organize together, to strive together, to disobey for a reason to regain a right. Yeah.
Right.
And in the case of people rising up because they don't get their day at the beach, is a little trivial compared to what some people have sacrificed.
Yeah. I mean,
to get what they want.
Yeah, we had the protests during Vietnam. Our family
Most
members,
definitely.
yes,
most definitely, yeah.
were being sent over to a war that most people didn't agree with. I won't
Did
get into
not agree with. Absolutely.
I will not get into the politics behind it, but we had the civil disobedience across the country during Vietnam to protest the war. Now it happened. We're there to protest something to gain back a right. Why are we doing something that we feel as Americans we shouldn't be doing? That's what this whole thing is about. But at the same time, the civil disobedience right now is a little trivial.
Well, it's to those who think that the lockdown is going to erode their civil rights and that life is going to change after this and the government is going to, I don't believe that. But if that does happen, then we do have this power of civil disobedience, and it's in a democracy, it's a very effective power.
Yes.
And no one could imagine that there was any type of anti-war movement during World War II, because we knew we were fighting a beast that would consume the world if we didn't.
Right.
And but our laws allow an individual, if their conscience doesn't allow them to go in that direction, to fight, allows them the right to protest.
Right.
And so civil disobedience is a part of our culture. It's a respected form of reform, and
in most cases, it has a positive outcome.
Yes, it does. It has it has effect on our institutions, because in our country, the laws are derived. The power to rule is derived from the laws from the people, and we may not believe that in total, but that is the way it's supposed to be.
Right. So protesting does work, but I'm not talking about the violent protesting. That's a completely different.
Absolutely.
The violent protesting is illegal. That's stupid. It's disruptive, and it actually hurts doing protesting correctly.
Well, and that's what Cesar Chavez realized. That's why he went on his fast. So the strike started in 1965. They'd been going for 3 years. By 1968, the farmers were getting more belligerent. They refused to even sit down and talk. Even have a non-binding negotiation, like, let's go to the coffee shop and just talk about this. What do you guys want? They refused to even have that conversation. So what instead they did is they brought in some thugs who incited fear and anger and violence. And there were rumors going around that some of the farm workers are going to get guns and retaliate. They'd been shot at, they'd been beaten, so they were going to shoot back. And that's when Cesar Chavez went on his fast. It's a fast for nonviolence. It was not a hunger strike. And so a fast is really derived from a religious exercise, a spiritual exercise where you look inside yourself. It's penitential. You're looking inside yourself and saying, what can I do to be a better person? What can I do to make a more positive contribution? Reflecting on your errors and your weaknesses. And the people, his followers, followed suit, and the violence stopped. Because Cesar Chavez knew the moment the strike turned violent, everything would be lost.
Right.
They would have the absolute right to call in the sheriff, the National Guard, whatever.
We see this in some of the protests within the last 10 years, where they've gotten violence and they call it a peaceful protest, that this is their right to destroy property. No, it's not. That's not a protest. I don't know what category that really falls under, but whatever message you're trying to get across is now lost.
Exactly. It destroys the credibility of the movement. And, we've seen that on both sides in our last political election. People on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, in the extreme elements, use violence as a form of anger. They let their anger get carried away with them.
Yeah.
And it does. It destroys the credibility of what you believe. Now, in other countries that don't have a democracy,
violence is the only way to get across a message.
Well, look what happens in Russia. If you protest too much, you get pushed off a bridge.
Yes.
Or you get some anonymously shot. Right now, the big controversy in Russia is doctors who don't agree with what's going on or happen to be falling out of windows. So it's this type of, and we saw that even in China, a doctor who brought to the attention this sickness early on, the Chinese government arrested him.
Yeah.
So in authoritative authoritative governments, societies, speaking your mind is a dangerous thing. And hopefully it doesn't get to be that here.
Very true. Well, we're almost out of time. So where can our listeners find you and your books?
Well, you can find at my website, johndesimone.com. That's DESIMONE. You also can find The Road to Delano on IndieBound at any of your independent bookstores, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. And that's my Facebook page, too, John DeSimone, author. And I'd be glad to, happy to see any of your listeners PM me or join my Facebook page and join the conversation on this exciting time in our American history.
Exactly. An author always loves to connect with the reader. If you're a reader
Absolutely.
and you're reading the book, give us feedback. We live for this stuff. Trust me. The good, the bad, everything.
Yes. So it's The Road to Delano by John DeSimone, and you can find it just about everywhere.
Sounds awesome, and thank you so much for being on the show today.
Melissa, thank you for having me.
And have a wonderful day and happy reading.
Same to you. Thank you.